Hello, this is the Duty to Warn vidcast, and I'm your host, John Gartner, and with us today is Dr. Howard Covitz. He is a psychologist and a psychoanalyst. For many years, he was a training analyst at the Institute for Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy. His list of publications goes on for 4 pages, but he nonetheless describes himself very humbly as a country psychoanalyst. Howard, you were one of the original people very early on who started mobilizing, one of the early mental health professionals who started mobilizing about Donald Trump way before the election. So tell me, as a psychologist, as a psychoanalyst, what was it you saw that alarmed you? What is your sense of what this guy's about, and why should we be worried?
Rather freewheeling question, John. It really began when I began being an adult. I mean, I got married in 1965. Mm-hmm. I had children. I have some responsibility for those children. I have 6 grandchildren. I worry about them. Yeah. And a guy comes into the marketplace running for president who's talking like a street fighter and not a very good street fighter, who's saying pretty horrible things to people. What does one do? I mean, I signed on to the manifesto, where I began talking about the rather natural balance that was necessary between Tarasov and Goldwater.
Yeah.
That didn't work out very well. I was excommunicated from that site.
Were you?
Yeah, with a phone call, not even a video chat. But a phone call saying, "Are you going to continue talking about this?" I said, "Chances are."
You were fired as badly as Comey.
Indeed. Just kicked out the door. So fun. I was arguing from an ancient perspective. If you look at the 5 books of Moses and almost go right to the middle of it, you'll find a sentence that is one of my favorite sentences because it talks about the complexity of being a professional or being a human being in general. It's cut up in 3 parts, and there's a way you know how it's cut up by the various notes that are traditionally used with it. But the first half is cut in 2 parts. So the first quarter, I used to be a mathematician. You'll have to allow me to look.
I noticed that in your resume.
Yeah, not for 40 some odd years, but so the first quarter is don't go loose-lipped among your people. Yeah? Absolutely no rumors, no gossip is allowed.
Right. So this isn't something you do casually, I think is what you're starting to say.
Well, then it goes on and says, but there were exceptions.
Right.
And the second quarter of the sentence says, you don't stand idly by as your neighbor bleeds.
Yeah.
So, there's the conflict. Yeah, I do think Donald Trump has a right to his privacy. I do. But not at the point where he becomes dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
The second part of the sentence is very terse. It says, I am God. Well, this ability to balance these 2 issues of, on the one hand, the need to protect that is required of teachers and therapists and lawyers and ministers, I think, maybe even ministers. On the one hand, there's that need to protect the Tarasov demands, and on the other hand, there's the Goldwater rule that says, we shouldn't gratuitously go around and evaluating people. We disagree a little bit on this, as you well know. I think we should be focusing on the man's dangerousness.
Sure, a lot of people say that.
Yes, I know. There's the Jim Gilligan, who has the advantage of being brilliant, It really is an advantage, let me tell you. Uh, I mean, he was focusing on that, and there, I think it's important to note that we don't measure danger or risk for danger in terms of probabilities. We don't do that. The same thing is true of global warming. We measure it. I mean, again, as an ex-mathematician, I'm wandering back into territory that I left around 1970. I mean, we measure it by looking at the probability times the outcome. So, for instance, if I have a 1% chance of losing $10, I'm not worried. It's 1% times $10. My risk is about a dime. If I have a 1% chance of dying in this YouTube exchange with you, I'm not going. I'm staying at home. I'm shutting you down. And here we have the same situation. And I began publishing certain kind of fairy tales. A guy comes into my office and he's talking like Donald Trump, and he's carrying a pea shooter. Can I let him out of my office? Well, I think that that manifesto website, the Citizen Therapist website, got nervous about another fable about a policeman that I published. He's driving down the road. He's behind some guy in a Bentley with orangey hair, and the guy is weaving down the road in a curious kind of way. And I stops him, and he looks in the window, and the guy's got an arsenal of weapons and a rocket propelled, whatever it's called, an RPG on the back seat. Yeah? And he asked the guy, what's about all of these guns? And the guy says, this is an open carry state. I'm allowed to carry them. And anyway, this is a dangerous kind of place. Meantime, he's screaming through his window at some immigrants walking down the street. Huh? They didn't like my metaphor at all. It wasn't a friendly metaphor, I guess. But I mean, what does the policeman do?
No, you raise an excellent point. When we're evaluating these two principles of Tarasov versus Goldwater, one of the things we have to look at is the risk assessment. And since the potential risk of a crazy, dangerous president is potentially annihilation of large parts of the human race, if we're going to weigh these two risks against each other, violating his privacy versus the end of life on Earth, these are not really equivalents.
No, they're not. And here's where we differ a little bit. I claim that the only thing we're looking at is risk. So, for instance, if someone comes in and I have reason to believe that that child is being molested by their parent, I don't need a diagnosis.
Right.
If I have a feeling that one of my patients is about to kill their wife's lover in a fit of pique, I don't need a diagnosis. The only thing I need to know is that there's a risk to another human being, or in this case, about 6.9 billion human beings.
So what do you think makes him dangerous, or what are the signs that show you he's dangerous?
Well, the simplest definition of mental health is 90 years old or something like that. It's essentially Freud's structural theory, and that is that the person has a capacity to recognize their own impulses, to recognize other people's impulses too, with some clarity. So that's the first part. The second part is that the person decides to judge whether or not acting on these impulses would be dangerous to other people. Yeah? And if, in fact, he finds out that it's not dangerous to himself or other people, he has the capacity and the sense of agency to act on it. And those are the second and third parts. Yeah? So those people who can't recognize reality and the reality of their own impulses are usually people with brain diseases such as schizophrenia and the psychoses. Those people who can't act on their impulses after they find out they're safe. So for instance, those people who force themselves to do things that are painful, which we call compulsions, or to not do things that are pleasurable, which we call prohibitions. Yeah? Or they obsess about things, or they have anxiety where they shouldn't have anxiety. I saw a bear Saturday morning up in Vermont. I mean, there was reason to have some anxiety. It prepares us not to be lunch. Yeah? Mm-hmm. The only two reasonable options are to run or to fight, right? I mean, those are the reasonable options, not to be lunch. Yeah? Okay, so those people who can't act on these things, we usually think of as having symptom disturbances. And they usually cause themselves a lot of pain. Yeah? They have limited lives. They don't have very exciting lives. They have restricted lives. The middle group of those people who either can't judge whether something's dangerous or don't care. Well, I mean, those are the people who have personality disorders, and those are maybe the most difficult group of people to treat. And those people tend to sometimes be dangerous. Now, not all of them. I've treated many people who have various personality disorders. I don't know about the Fromian one. I really like that diagnosis, by the way. I think is very powerful. Fromm is a much...
the malignant narcissism that he introduced, you mean, that diagnosis?
Yeah, he was malignantly ignored, by the way, Fromm, who chances are published more books than all the psychoanalysts put together. In my last estimate, he sold 65 million books. You get roughly 100,000 books for every book that has my name on it that's out in the marketplace. No? I do like Trump for that diagnosis. I do. But I don't have enough evidence to really affirm that, and I don't need it. He does have the stigmata of personality disorders. At least he presents them. There are 6 of them that are kind of stacked, and they begin. Let me go back. If I'm a geek and I write theory, that's what I do besides being a clinician. So let me go back. The presumption is the child is born without any of these capacities. They really don't have a sense of what their impulses are. They don't know how to control them, and they don't know quite how to act on them. They aren't mature enough. But who are the people out in their world? The people out in their world are more or less chambermaids of 2 types. There are those chambermaids who satisfy their needs, and those who don't. And that's pretty much it. And the other people remain kind of objects in their world. They haven't become what I call subjects in their own right.
Yeah.
With their own thoughts, with their own relationships. I mean, imagine Jeb Bush had to go home after being called a total loser, a low-energy loser, and he had to go home to his wife, who had also been insulted by this man. Yeah? The question comes, and I'll get there in a few moments, how do we get to that point where we care? Yeah? And why should we care? I have something here. You asked me if I had any thoughts, and the only thing I could write down was this thing from Doug Hammarskjöld, who was the second, what was he called, Secretary General of the United Nations. He said, do you wish to forfeit even that little which your efforts may have entitled you? Why should we share? Huh? Only if your endeavors are inspired by a devotion, he said, to duty in which you forget yourself completely. I'm looking at a description of what I would think is a reasonably decent president, by the way. Can you keep your faith in their value? This being so, your endeavor to reach the goal should have taught you to rejoice when others reach it. Huh? How does the child make it there? Okay, so the first thing is, and I think it's the first stigmata of all personality disorders, is that failure of empathy, is that failure to recognize the other as cut from the same fabric that I'm cut from. And therefore, since he's just like me or she's just like me, I can't put her through the kind of pain that I would put others through, who say we're enemies. Yeah? There are enemies, I suppose. The problem with that is it leaves a splitting of the mind in place. Yeah? Everyone, and this is the second part of the stigma, if you would, everyone is either with me or against me. There are no other categories.
Right.
None. And these lead to four others. One, because of this, they lack the capacity to evaluate or care about any kind of results that others may have arrived at, or anything that's valuable to someone else, and it makes their thinking rather simple. There's a certain advantage to splitting, and that is I can think quickly. The only thing I do is what my impulse tells me to do. I act on it. So impulsivity, leads to this lack of affect control. It leads to a lack of impulse control. And due to that lack of respect for others, they have no particular interest in extant organizations. So NATO, somebody else thought about that. It has no meaning to me. Yeah? The United Nations, it's been around for how many years now? 65 years or so. It makes no meaning to me. The judiciary, no, I didn't put it together. It's not mine. Yeah. All of this I'm claiming comes out of the failure to have empathy for another and to realize that someone else is a subject in their own right, is a person, with feelings, with thoughts, with relationships. Hopefully the child realizes that it's in the relationship to the parents, who initially are chambermaids, but eventually finds out they have a relationship, and it's a loving, caring relationship with any luck.
And I think what you're saying is that Trump is developmentally fixated at that first stage where people are either meeting his needs or not meeting his needs, but don't yet exist as human beings outside of himself.
You would say that. And I would get stuck. I'm stuck too. In saying he shows these things. And he shows, because of this, no nuance in his thinking. If the only thing that matters is what I'm thinking, I don't need nuance. There are not two not unreasonable positions, and I like that particular structure. You have come to the conclusion that it's reasonable to diagnose him. Yeah? Yeah, you have.
Yes.
And I don't find that a not unreasonable position. I don't find that, I find that a not unreasonable position. And that's another thing, by the way, that He's actually one of my favorite thinkers, Doug Hammarskjöld, that he said, I don't know when or with who, or if I even said anything, but there was a certain point when someone said something, and I said, yes, it could be. These people don't have that capacity. And he shows that incapacity. So when somebody disagrees with him, they're wrong. You disagree with me, you're wrong. And finally, because of that,
and then maybe you're an enemy.
You're bad, and if you open up your mouth, you are to be disposed of. I was talking on Friday in New York at the International Psychohistorical Association, and someone in the audience said, the only thing in psychology that's predictive is previous behavior. I didn't want to answer his question, actually, because there's a lot of previous behavior that's destructive. His point was he hasn't murdered anybody, as far as we know. He's just talked about it. He grabs the little pussy. We don't even have evidence that he's ever raped anybody, or any strong evidence. Yeah. So if you pile all these together, he also has no capacity because of this to distinguish anything except his impulse. So reality, truth, has no particular meaning. It's the impulse. I'm going to act on the impulse, and that's it. So he shows all of these.
I'd like to switch gears for a moment. You actually started by talking about the 5 books of Moses. You sent me a message earlier to say that I should stop rocking back and forth on these broadcasts because I looked like I was davening. So we got a couple of old Jews here talking just between us on this broadcast. We mentioned Erich Fromm and his malignant narcissism diagnosis that he developed to explain Hitler, whose Germany he fled. And so...
in general.
Yeah. And so, and it describes tyrants in general. It was not just Hitler, but Stalin, and we could apply it to Pol Pot, many other dictators, sadistic dictators, as Landstotos calls them. So, as a couple of old Jews, you and I have heard the phrase, never again, never again, never again. It's been beaten into our heads. Never forget, never forget, never forget. So how did everyone forget?
Why do we keep forgetting?
Yeah. How's everyone forgotten? Why aren't we seeing the danger for what it is, given the World War we just fought only 70 years ago? What are your thoughts about that?
Asking why 48% of the country doesn't see that danger?
Or is there something about that danger you'd like to tell them?
I think 50% of the country or more sees that danger and is in fear. I have people coming to consult with me simply because they're afraid. They're afraid for themselves. They're afraid for their children. I saw the fear in me because I was using a lot of humor in my attacks, and I would call them attacks on Trump. I called him all kinds of names. I called him Herr Drumpf. I used his German name. I did clown videos making fun of him. I'm a psychoanalyst, the conservative guy. I lead a quiet life. I really do. And my family is sitting there, including I'm including my youngest child, who's a therapist, saying, "Dad, how can you do this?" I felt like I was Don Quixote, tilting at windmills, and they felt that they had to save me from it. So I was using humor and continue to as a defense against fear. It's, by the way, talking about scriptures, it's one of the earliest defenses mentioned in somewhere in Genesis 15, 16 or something like that. Some guys come along and tell Sarah that at 90 she's going to have a baby. And she's listening as they're telling her husband, because she didn't have to be told, she was just a lady. And she begins laughing. And her husband confronts her, Sarah's laughing. Why is Sarah laughing? Lama tzachaka Sarah. Why is she laughing? And she says, and it's the first mention I know in Scripture of a defense. She said, Lo tzachakti, I wasn't laughing. Ki yareya, I was frightened. So indeed, I think we have a whole country that is defending against the terror of Trump. And they are literally not aware, many of them, how dangerous they are, and the rest of us are quite aware. And then we're having nightmares, we're frightened, our patients are frightened. And this guy, I have a son who was in Qatar last week doing business, and this president of ours is starting a war with Qatar, more or less. Why does he want to start a war with anyone? Why does he want to have an arm wrestling contest with the president of France, or offend the English, or the New Zealanders, or the Aussie? What is the matter with this man? Why does he offend everybody? And he does. That having been said, by the way, I feel a debt of gratitude to him. He's done something for our community that no one has done. We have a very fractious community. I don't know how you practice, but even if you just look at one part of the mental health community, say the psychoanalysts, the amount of internecine conflict inside the community is enormous. I wrote a paper that appears in the American Journal some years ago on why analysts hate each other. No, why? And why can't they tolerate, in the same way that I'm asking why the little child hasn't yet learned that other people have a right to their own gods, their own theories, their own religion, their own skin color, their own genitals. Why? Yeah? And how do we get to that point? I think, by the way, that's the big mystery in psychology. How do we get to that point where we really give a damn about somebody else, particularly in a post-religious world? We don't have a God looking down for half the country or more saying, if you do that, I'm going to get you. Look out, girl, because I'm going to get you. No, we don't have that. Why do we get to a point? How does the child get to a point where they really care? And that's the question that Doug Hammarskjöld is asking. Why do we? Why should we care? I care about my grandchildren. I assume you have family. They don't let me forget. I look at them. I was at my oldest child's high school graduation this past weekend. And I was looking at her and thinking she has a right to live. Excuse me, another biblical. There's a story in Judges about the Agamemnon of the Jews. There's a guy named Yiftach in Hebrew. And he's the son of a hooker woman. Who do you hire as a soldier, as a general? And that's where we hire our soldiers and send them off to die. We hire the poor. So he does what Agamemnon does. He goes and conquers the enemy, as he was asked to do, the Midianites there. And then he comes home and promises to sacrifice the first thing out the door, which is his daughter. Yeah. And she says to him, I haven't even grown old enough to go out to the mountains and play with my friends. So if you ask me why I got involved, as one of your first questions here, I'm getting involved because I have these 6 grandchildren and I look at them and they have a right to life. Can I argue that in terms of basic premises of why I believe that? No, but I do believe that. I believe that other people have a right to live and to live with respect, And this man doesn't show people that respect and is threatening us. You know?
I think that's an excellent statement, a very heartfelt statement about the real, terrible, and genuine risk that is motivating you, who otherwise would not be out there in the public square, as it were. So I think that's very, very helpful to hear.
It motivated you as well.
Exactly.
I think that this is a very human thing we're doing. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, curiously, it took Trump to bring the community together. I think whether we support Goldwater or not, I don't. I support that balance. That's what the Greeks talked about in Sophrosune. I mean, it's this balance, sanity. They're the same word for both. Yeah.
Well, as you know, in the Talmud, it says that you can break any one of the 613 commandments to save a life.
Yes, indeed. Any one of them.
So I think we can break the Goldwater commandment to save what may be millions of lives.
Without a doubt. I have no difficulty talking about Trump at all. I can't conclude as to what his diagnosis is. Is he suffering from an early form of dementia? I've read arguments that are quite convincing.
Yeah.
Is he suffering from malignant narcissism? Yeah, I introduced about 25 years ago my simplest definition of narcissism, of pathological narcissism, and that is the inability to accept other people's healthy narcissism. Mm-hmm. And I need to accept that other people have that right to live and that right to feel good about themselves. And this man defies that.
So when you talk about this risk, so many people have said, well, this is just a partisan endeavor. Could you speak to that? That was it a partisan motivation that caused you to speak out?
Am I a partisan?
Well, a political partisan. In other words, being a Democrat that caused you to speak out, for example, about Donald Trump. That's what we're being accused of by many people, that this is just a group of people who are sour grapes. They lost the election. But you're talking about something that is much more profound and much more frightening.
Yeah, I certainly am a partisan. I certainly believe in... the Founding Fathers set this up as a conflict between free enterprise and the social contract. And many of us, and the Jewish texts, lean on the side of the social contract. Yeah. Although they talk about balance. So Hillel says, ultimately it's a balance between loving yourself and loving others. And if you get caught in that balance, he says, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And then his third principle is that if you get stuck with that, you're immobilized, which any psychologist, I think, of any stripe will tell you, that somehow that conflict between self-love and other love, if you get caught up in it, if you get caught up deciding, did I let that person into traffic because I just wanted to look good? Or did I let that person into traffic because I wanted to be kind to them? If I get caught up in that, I'm locked for the moment. Well, totally locked. Well, his third principle is if you do get locked, if not now, then when, you have to have action. So my action is to move on the side of the social contract, inside of providing things for people who are needy, who are weak, who are ill. I don't think anyone could argue that I'm not a partisan. I still have an Obama-Biden sign on my lawn. I am. I didn't always agree with the previous administration, but I had a sense that they represent decency, and a degree of caring for others. And those are principles that I think are very important to me.
So what is it you're afraid might happen, or what is it you predict might happen going forward with Donald Trump?
Oh, I think it's happening already. In the appointment to the cabinet of people who are really dirty. Betsy DeVos is crossing the lines between state and church openly. My Tillerson was involved in the Chad massacre of people in order for Exxon to buy oil. He's hired people who are, I don't know what to call, schmutzy. They're dirty people. And he has attacked people opening up the gates of hell. We have an increase in the number of hate crimes all over the place. I'd be afraid to be a Muslim. I would be terrified. I'm a little afraid to be a Jew in the United States. I've had 37 threats against me because of my blog, which ran from last summer into after the election. I became, sometimes I think of it, I told you I just took a nap, I became deflated mouse. I just lost the energy and enjoyed the fact that you were carrying the ball. Sorry, Guy, but I was pleased that somebody else was doing the heavy lifting, and you are.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, we all are, but I appreciate that. But I think you make a very good point, which is that it reminds me of that quote about they came for the gays and I wasn't gay, so I said nothing, and they came for the Jews, I wasn't a Jew, so I said nothing, and they came for me and there was no one left to say anything. I think maybe as Jews, we are perhaps a little more sensitive to the idea of scapegoating of a religious minority. And so, no, we're not Muslims. But at the same time, we can be afraid for Muslims and appreciate how afraid they must feel to be in that scapegoated position within a society.
If we can accept them as subjects in their own right, as people who go to bed and worry about their grandchildren who are just like me, except with certain differences. Yeah, I had large parts of my family killed during the war. Mostly in Auschwitz. My mother's side of the family was Hungarian. And the guy I was named after, my great-great-grandfather, my grandfather's grandfather, he fried in Auschwitz. Hundreds of people in the family. I grew up in a home in which on holidays my grandmother would light, I don't know how many lights. It would be a table full of lights, each one with a name on it. Yeah. Partisan? You bet your bippy I'm a partisan. This is very personal, and it would be personal, I think, even if I were not Jewish. I feel that other people have a right to live. I don't know that I can explain to you, John, why I think my grandchildren deserve a chance to have a good life, and why the half of the population who lives on the shores of the ocean have a right not to be wiped out by the rising seas 40, 50 years after I'm dead. Après-moi la déluge, right? It has new meaning to it these days. Global warming is threatening to wipe out large centers of population, the greatest of which are on the shores of our oceans. The oceans rise a foot, and we're in big trouble. Same thing, by the way, the same argument about risk. It doesn't matter that the risk may be small. Maybe the scientists are wrong, and the risk is only 2%. but 2% of wiping out 3 billion people's homes? You don't take that risk cavalierly. And this man is cavalier because the only thing that matters is his own thinking. You cannot have someone who's a leader and feel safe if they don't have that capacity to balance a variety of different thoughts. It's somewhere in the start of the Ethica Eudemia, Aristotle says that virtue is the ability to realize that you're always choosing between two goods. Like Goldwater and Tarasov.
Right.
I mean, they are both goods.
That image of the candles with the different names of the members of your family who died in the Holocaust is a very powerful image. And you mentioned that hate crimes spiked dramatically after his election, including hate crimes against Jews, Jewish cemeteries being attacked, swastikas appearing everywhere, but not just against Jews. But this also is reminiscent of what happened at the time that Hitler and other dictators have risen. I maybe not so humorously called it Kristallnacht Light, the first after the election when there was this immediate wave of sort of low-scale hate crimes, but to a quantity that was like up 300-400%. It sounds like it has some of that resonance for you as well.
Am I inside? In my soul? Yeah. I read it in my dreams. I read it everywhere. I read it in my grandchildren's questions. What does this mean? What does it mean that our president during the election was telling people to beat people up? Or what does it mean? And for me, this was a big turning point. He was being interviewed, and I don't recall who the interviewer was, but the interviewer asked him, "Have you sacrificed?" It was right after the insult of the cons. Yeah? Have you sacrificed? His response was telling. His response was, "I gave people jobs." That's a sacrifice. Hold on. A previous president says that nobody ever makes it to where they are without a leg up. He gets attacked by that. For that. This president says that somehow giving another person a job for a fair day's pay, which they don't always get, is somehow him sacrificing. Anything that he doesn't eat is something taken out of his mouth, in his mind. This is the way he presents himself, as I argue in a chapter for Bandy's book. Maybe he's putting on a Colbert act. But if he is, he's hurting a lot of people along the way. I don't think, for instance, I've argued that I have no reason to assume he's racist or sexist. None. I'm perfectly willing to assume that he's willing to use racism and sexism for his own benefit. Now, that doesn't mean he really hates people who have a different color than him. I know sociologically we'd still categorize that as a form of racism, but he uses things, apparently, for his own benefit without that second bit of health that says, so I have to evaluate whether this is going to hurt somebody. First thing, cause no harm. Really, first thing. Now, indeed, there are times I need to cause harm. There are times I need to go to war. In Croatia, I assume it was important in Serbia for us to go to war. And people died. I think there are times when all alternatives have been exhausted, and we do go to war. I don't know that I'm a pacifist.
Well, I want to thank you for speaking with me today, and thank you for your activism, and let us hope that our grandchildren do make it.
All the best, John.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.